Program that we do on the first Thursday of every month, or at least we will in March and April. We'll take a little bit of a hiatus. The topic today is Sacramento's restaurant renaissance, and we're going to be talking about the people who really altered the food landscape in Sacramento. So, I'll introduce Kate in just a minute. In recent years, we've received a lot of accolades and our first Michelin star guides for being a really great food town. There was a recent article in the New York Times, and we consistently rate among the 3 most diverse cities in the United States. Our food from the beginning, from the gold rush on, has been incredibly diverse in terms of the variety of different kinds of cuisines that you could eat here. Later, I'm going to ask Kate specifically to talk about Billy No, who is up as a semifinalist for the James Beard Award, and Takahara, I'm going to forget his first name, from Binchiyaka, who was also in the running. One of the things that I'm positing is something a little different. Kate and I might disagree on some things, and that's that I think that Sacramento has been a great restaurant town literally since the early 1970s. I'm going to concentrate a lot on those early food pioneers. Kate's going to talk a lot about what's happened since 2000 on. And just a little bit about me. I'm a culinary historian. I wrote a book called Lost Restaurants of Sacramento and Their Recipes. This is the first in what I hope will be a series of talks, because I really should do another book, even though other books get in the way. The audience asked me earlier, I eat out a lot. I literally eat out 5 or more times a week. I try a new restaurant if I can every week, and it's going to take me a long time to get through them all, let me just tell you. I'm joined today by Kate Washington, and Kate is going to talk more about herself. I first met her, I think, when she was a reviewer for the News and Review, which, and she's got a long history before that. She also wrote for Sacktown Magazine, and she took over for Blair Robertson from the Sacramento Bee, or someone else?
It was Carla.
Oh, Carla, from the Sacramento Bee. I refer to her as a restaurant reviewer. She calls herself a critic. Later, I'm going to ask her what the difference is.
March and I'm not doing either one anymore now.
She's not doing either one anymore. Yeah. And I want to make it clearer. One of the reasons why I can eat out so much, and I never accept a meal from anyone, is I'm not a critic, so restaurateurs like me. Also in the audience is Marge Tarbell, and she is a wonderful co-moderator. She'll be helping get people from the audience. But I'm going to turn it over to Kate. I'll say one more thing. We're members of La Dame d'Escoffier, which we'll also talk about later. Kate, talk about yourself.
Hi, I'm Kate Washington. I have been in Sacramento since 2004, but I'm a Northern California native. I actually grew up in Chico, and my mother was here in Sacramento since 1990, so I'd been visiting the area and eating in its restaurants for a long time before I actually moved here, but I have been here for 20 years. Prior to moving here, I was in San Francisco for 5 years, working at food magazines, including Sunset Magazine. And when I moved here, I became a freelance writer, which I've been for the entire rest of my career. But my main gig, as Mary Ellen said, was with the Sacramento News and Review. I was their critic, reviewer, whatever you want to call it. I actually kind of use the terms interchangeably, from 2004 to 2008. Then I was a contributing writer at Sacktown Magazine, focusing mainly on dining and profiles of restaurants, things like that, for quite a long time. At the same time, I was raising kids and just living life. Had a lot of other things happen. In 2017, the Sacramento Bee reached out to me. Their reviewer was leaving, Carla Meyer, and they needed somebody to take over. So I started doing that on a contract basis. I want to be clear, I was never a full-time employee at the Bee, but I continued doing that until approximately March 13th, 2020. I don't know if anyone remembers what happened then, but all the restaurants shut down and there was nothing to review. So that kind of stopped. I did do some stories on takeout and the way restaurants pivoted and what they did, and I think I'm sure we'll talk about this later, there was a lot of really interesting creativity and changes to how restaurants operated that, one of the hallmarks, I think, of the entire restaurant industry is that it's such a difficult business. People are constantly having to innovate and find new ways to stand out, et cetera. And the pandemic, upped that difficulty level to 11, or by exponentially. So that was just a very interesting time, and I did do a little bit of coverage in that time. Since then, I've been focusing on other kinds of writing projects. I haven't been focusing on food writing, but I do continue to dine out, enjoy the restaurant scene. I was working on a book at the time, like concurrently with being a reviewer. So my book came out in 2021. Is that okay to introduce my book? My book is actually a book about family caregiving in the U.S. and the challenges, the systemic and personal and emotional and all kinds of challenges that come to family caregivers, the degree to which the healthcare system is asking more and more of caregivers, and it's based on my personal experience of caring for my former husband through a bone marrow transplant. It's called Already Toast, Caregiving and Burnout in America. So it is unrelated to food, though it does actually have a bit of food content because there is some interesting, I found out a lot of things about hospital food systems and like dietary regulations and things like that when he couldn't eat for several months, but it's not related to the other things.
So I
yes.
have to tell you that her loss of a husband was my gain, not in the way that you think. He's literally my next door neighbor, and he has been a guest on the program, a fantastic poet. One of the things that I wanted to do, just to kind of set the stage, is a little bit about statistics, and Kate might know some of this, so I'll throw it out to her. Earlier I asked the audience how often they ate out. I'll ask you in the studio audience as well. And I just want somebody, you guys already know the answer, somebody throw out the answer of what you think the average Sacramentan eats out in Sacramento. Anyone? Don't remember from earlier? It includes DoorDash, yes. 3 times a week. 5 times a week. 5 times a week is actually the average, but I couldn't figure out if that includes Starbucks. Right? One of the things is that it is almost impossible, even though we have the Sacramento Restaurant Association and the California Restaurant Association, to find out how many restaurants we actually have in Sacramento, and the numbers don't add up. So there's some figures that say that there are 1,749, but if you go on to Yelp or TripAdvisor, there are over 2,200. Anybody in the audience guess what the #1 cuisine is for people eating out? Cheeseburgers. Italian, what else? Pizza, anybody else? Mexican, you are right. So of those, first of all, 979 are considered fast food. Mexican is the #1. I have a feeling that means Taco Bell. I hope not. There are 598 coffee shops, and I didn't write it down, but I'm hoping that when Kate talks later, she wrote, I think, the definitive article on Sacramento's third wave coffee, and I think that they really do impact where we're even getting our food today. There are only 79 Chinese restaurants. That is very much down because there was a time when there were over 200 in Sacramento, most affected by the pandemic, and if you've seen David Suhu, by laws that are starting to affect them. We're going to end up spending a lot of time probably talking about fine dining establishments. I'm going to ask Kate to explain what a fine dining establishment is.
I mean, that's it is a little bit tough to define, and I think it's interesting. I was thinking about this actually as you were talking about the number of restaurants and the difficulty in defining it, because everybody defines a restaurant or an eating establishment differently as well. And I was actually thinking like some of the difference could be accounted for by like Do you count a gas station that has hot dogs? Like, it is a place you can get prepared food. Does it count as a restaurant? Probably not, but maybe in some statistics. I mean, I think fine dining restaurants is one of those things where we know it when we see it. It's the place you would go on a date where you might book your Valentine's Day meal for next week, something like that. I think the marker used to be white tablecloth, but there is a move toward more casual manners, preparation, decor, kind of across the restaurant industry. So that's no longer, I think, such a dividing line. You know, the way a restaurant has, you know, the hushed, widely spaced, white tablecloth restaurant, tables and everything. But it is, you know, a higher price point, a sit-down meal, often multi-course, with a chef that you might, know or recognize the name of. A distinctive kind of menu that might change seasonally. I'm sure we'll talk a great deal about that, the move toward more seasonal cuisine, more locally sourced or more clearly sourced cuisine and food items, where on the menu it says where your food is coming from down to the farm. The fine dining is what is typically, I think, covered in the pages of magazines and newspapers, though I do think there has been a real move toward broadening out and toward covering the much wider array, which makes restaurant writing and restaurants more accessible to a way larger variety of people, because most people cannot afford the fine dining restaurants that are downtown. When I was reviewing for the News and Review, for instance, also Sacramento's restaurant scene is not big enough to produce 52 reviews a year on fine dining establishments. So I covered everything from taquerias and all kinds of things on up. I actually once did a review of the food at the State Fair, which was really fun, actually, to go around and taste everything. But what I always aimed to do was kind of think about whether a restaurant was doing well at the mission that it had set for itself. So it wasn't like comparing apples to oranges of like, what does the taqueria have versus what does the kitchen have, and are they of the same, quality, complexity, array of food items and choices. But is the taqueria the best taqueria it can be? Is the fine dining restaurant the best fine dining restaurant it can be? And if you are going out to have that experience as a consumer, would you, in my opinion, which is obviously always subjective, would you be satisfied with that? And that was kind of the criterion that I tried to judge on, and to not think necessarily about like fine dining as a hierarchy where it's up above and then it falls down by price point. I hoped to apply a somewhat more egalitarian set of criteria.
And I'm glad that she mentioned that you couldn't sustain 52 a year, because only 79 restaurants out of that total are considered fine dining today. And only 2% of us eat on a regular basis in fine dining restaurants. What's the number one type of restaurant you think we eat out at or get takeout from? Fast food, absolutely. And there's a new movement towards fast casual and casual restaurants that I hope that Kate will talk about. Again, because I'm a historian, I always like to just give a kind of a foundation of what was happening before what I call the California Renaissance. And prior to the 1960s, how many of you lived in the 40s, 50s, or 60s here in Sacramento, or anywhere but here? Great. So I did. You hear me over and over again. I grew up at the corner or far down in the projects in New Helvetia on Broadway. So Broadway was my world. Elaine Korn, who we'll also talk about, did a wonderful series for Capital Public Radio on basically traveling the world in 30 blocks. But when I was a kid and prior to the 60s, most of us ate out in cafeterias, smorgasbords, drive-ins. Chinese restaurants were the number one, by the way, restaurant in Sacramento. Most people worked downtown or in the central city. We didn't call it Midtown. Now that didn't occur until 1976. And they had jobs in government. Sacramento was a 24-hour city. Southern Pacific, Pacific Bell, all of those places, Palm Iron, the canneries. So there were restaurants that were literally open 24 hours a day. Most of them served what we kind of call lunch, or fast casual food. Most people only had like 20 minutes for lunch. There were all kinds of restaurants that I grew up in the West End, where there were a large amount of black restaurants, Mexican restaurants, Japanese, Chinese. That was all obliterated during redevelopment, and that also affected how restaurants changed in Sacramento. And that again ended when we got rid of trolley cars in 1947. And white flight. There were neighborhood restaurants, every neighborhood had one, but people started leaving the central city and the core city and moving into the suburbs, which took a long time really to catch up. What did we eat? What do you think we ate? You're too young. She's a whole generation. What do you think we ate in the 50s and 60s?
50s and 60s. Well, you said Chinese restaurants were the number one, the cafeterias and automats and things like that. But
meat.
Yes, meat, steak and potatoes.
Steak and potatoes, prime rib. You could go to almost any restaurant, fine dining or a coffee house, and literally that's what you would end up getting. The 50s actually started to see, as I said, a flight. You started seeing a move out towards the suburbs, and restaurants started beginning on Fulton Avenue, Howe Avenue, later Fair Oaks Boulevard. And then the ones that I loved, and you're going to recognize, the Rosemont Grill, the Coral Reef. A lot of people had mentioned that. Tiki Village. A lot of the men were coming back from Italy and from the South Pacific, and we're opening up those kinds of restaurants. Luigi's, 1953, first pizza parlor, but Shakey's first franchise for pizza. And one of the things that I will say is Sacramento has always been a big franchise town. We're going to be talking about independence. We're going to avoid the chains. But I do want to say that in the 50s, a young man by the name of Harlan Sanders, I don't know if that name is familiar to you, he thought that his fried chicken was better than roasted chicken. You're going to get to tell your roasted chicken story. And he literally met Aldo Bavera. I don't know if anybody recognized the name Aldo Bavera. Aldo's Restaurant, which was in Town and Country, owned a coffee house called the Pine Cove. And Harlan came to him and sold him his chicken recipe, his fried chicken recipe, and was trying to franchise what would become Kentucky Fried Chicken. But before we go, I found out you have a wonderful roasted chicken story.
Well, I don't know if you all are familiar with roasted chicken. It's not as available anymore, but it still is around. But mine is actually a story of missing out on it. And this would have been about 19 years ago. I was about 8.5 months pregnant with my first child, who is now a college freshman, so it's easy for me to know when that was. And I had a tremendous craving for roasted chicken and really, really wanted that, but it was like, I was exhausted, it was late. I didn't want to go out and pick it up. This was prior to DoorDash. So I was like, oh, you know what? I'll just eat something we have in the house and we'll go get the roasted chicken tomorrow at Joe Marty's, if you all remember Joe Marty's on Broadway. That happened to be the night that Joe Marty's burned down, so I never got my roasted chicken. I would still like to get it, but I should seek out another
and
thing.
There is still roasted chicken
another place
at Rich Maid in Lodi. Still has the original recipe. Roasted chicken isn't roasted chicken unless they cook it in a broaster with the broaster seasonings. And I forgot to bring the sign. I still have the sign for it. So I'm going to take her to Lodi.
I will hold you to it. Thank you.
Right. So there are some people that might even claim that our Renaissance has started as early as 1960 when the Koch brothers opened the house restaurant in Old Sacramento. It hadn't yet been converted. It was very risky for them to try to do fine dining establishment in the slums or Skid Row. And then Aldo's opened soon after. And there are restaurants that are significant that are still around that we still eat at. Vic's, which started in 1947, Gunther's, which started in 1940. They're certainly not fine dining, but we also had Dunlap's, which was a black restaurant that was in Oak Park, that was considered probably the premier fine dining establishment. And only white people could go to it, although he would open on Sundays to blacks, but the egalitarian nature of it is he would be at the State Fair every summer, and so you could eat the food there. That brings me to the 60s and the 70s. And I have been quoted as saying Randy Perigary changed everything. I'm wrong. Started 10 years long before Randy Perigary opened first Parapow Palace, Lord Beaverbrooks. He started the Fern Bar kind of crowd. He owned the Arbor, Spataro's, a lot of restaurants. But it was really quite earlier that it was actually the women that I think changed the face and created the Renaissance. And before, has anybody ever heard of Alice Waters from Chez Panisse in Berkeley as being significant? We actually started I think earlier. First of all, when she started Chez Panisse, she and decided to do baby vegetables, she went to a Sacramento person to actually grow them. Sally Schmidt, who ended up opening up the French Laundry, had a farm both in Citrus Heights and one off of El Centro, so she was really significant. Juliana, these names are also Kate Sinclair. The Argonaut in Jackson was an incredible restaurant, and one of the first where she grew her vegetables and everything there, slaughtered her own animals. The people who worked for her were artists, and she would provide housing for them as well. And predated, I'm going to say, again, Alice Waters. And then Juliana Harris, who I'll go into some detail later, who started first Juliana's Kitchen, then Pava's, then Mum's. Teresa Urkowski, who's now teaching at ARC. Donna Norden is a woman who you've never heard of, but to me, she made Perigary's and never gets the credit. She was the restaurant consultant who talked them into having a brick pizza oven and created the mushroom and Jarlsberg salad, which is so important. Yes. Nick Vickers was a French teacher at Sac State and opened up a movable feast French restaurant that later became Mayfam, took over to start the Lemongrass. Peg Tomlinson, who had a catering firm. It was almost impossible for women to own restaurants, so a lot of the women who were caterers started their own restaurants. Mm-hmm. There was the first start of what he called takeout, gourmet takeout, where you could not only, you could pick out food from a counter and sit down. This is before oboes, before Sellens, I might mention. Joan Leineke, who is also a caterer, and Bobbin Charrington. I don't know if the name Bobbin sounds familiar. Do you know who Bobbin Charrington is?
I, of course, know who Bobbin Charrington is. She is now known as Bobbin Mulvaney and is Patrick Mulvaney's wife and partner in Mulvaney's, but was in restaurants and very significant in them long before Mulvaney's.
Yeah, and she was the caterer, and I'm, of course, going to blame her name. She was at the convention center, would do 6,000 meals a day that were better than any restaurant was serving at the time. Georgia Griffiths, who owned a Shot of Class downtown. Bernice Hagen, who was also a teacher. One of my favorite and who really influenced me was Ann Shelton at Wolf's Restaurant. Wolf's Restaurant was the start of Gourmet Gulch. She was, she did almost all of the recipes there, and they were mostly French cooking. I just happened to have all of her recipes, which I'm willing to share one day. And a few years later, other names that you're going to know, Biba Cagiona, I've always pronounced that one wrong, My Fam, Lena Fatt, who came into the Frank Fatt family, Gayla Mace, Kathy Riley is somebody else, Barbara Mikasic, who took over Rosemont Grill and started Andiamo and then the Limelight, and a host of other restaurant women and chefs who led the movement. Before I go further, though, a lot of those women were members of La Dame d'Escoffier. So I'm going to throw it to Kate to talk a little bit about what that is.
Sure, this is actually a national organization for women in food, and not just restaurateurs, but it includes farmers, winemakers, people in the beverage industry, writers such as myself, a wide array of women whose professions touch on the broad food and food service industry. And so it's a professional organization, but designed to promote networking. We give scholarships to aspiring farmers, aspiring chefs. There are chapters all over the place. The Sacramento chapter is one of the slightly newer and not as big as like the San Francisco chapter, but it's really thriving and growing. I happen to be on the board. Mary Ellen is a longtime member.
Former board member.
Yeah, and it's a wonderful organization, and through it I've met, not just many of the folks that Mary Ellen just mentioned, but also the new wave of people who are women who are really influencing the restaurant scene, but also the beverage scene, which goes kind of hand in hand, like winemaking, beer making, even cider, some of these elements of the scene, and the farmers, which, if I may for a moment, I wanted to underscore what Mary Ellen said about Chez Panisse and the produce of the Bay Area. And when people think of California cuisine and the California cuisine revolution of the 70s, they look at the Bay Area. When I got to the Bay Area, now I was born in Chico, I'm the daughter of a farmer. We always had homegrown vegetables and homegrown fruit. He grows almonds, or as we say in Chico, almonds, and always had a vegetable garden like this. I went away to college. I was shocked and horrified by what vegetables were like elsewhere. And then I came to the Bay Area and started going to farmers markets and hearing a lot. I'd already been hearing a lot about California cuisine and the influence that it was having nationally because of the approach of taking really fresh local produce and showcasing that and making it shine. You know what the San Francisco farmers markets are full of? Produce from the Central Valley. There is stuff from around the Bay Area, but I looked at the names of the towns where things were coming from, and it's very little of this is from the Bay Area proper. It's from here. And I think the food scene here, I'm sure we'll talk about this, has pushed that forward and recognized that much more in recent years. But those resources were always available to us and were always part of here. It was just less publicized and got less of the credit, as frankly farmers often do, but get less of the credit. But those resources were available in Sacramento, and some of the early restaurants that Mary Ellen was speaking of we're using that, and that's certainly a huge hallmark of the fine dining scene, especially today. And we have, amazing produce delivery organizations and places that where you can get the very best and the very freshest from this region. And I think it's wonderful that we've leaned into that.
Right. Good. So there's a lot of men that were influencers. I want to call out Herb Finger, who was the first chef. He ran a place called Bon Appetit, came from stockbrokering, and said, you know what, I'm going to wear a white chef's jacket to show that we're clean in the back. And he was the first person to do that and to introduce wine dinners and wine pairings. And so he was somebody who's really significant. Rick Mahan is somebody, a water boy, but started off at Perigari's. David Suhu, who has given a lot of programs here. I first ate at his father's restaurant, the Teacup, probably in 1960 on 21st Street. It was a Chinese-American restaurant. It was where you could go for Thanksgiving because they always did turkey. And David does a wonderful talk on Chicago Chinese turkey that I'm hoping he's going to do here for Thanksgiving. And there was also we're going to argue possibly. All right, I'm going to name people. Jim LaPerriere was Biba, Started off at the Inland Fish Market, sous chef at Biba, opened a Slocum House, which was fine dining, and opened up a Notria. He has sadly left us. Doug Silva, who was also Biba, Sheldon's Inn. Jean-Luc Chassereau, who opened Lautrec. Paul D'Alessandro and his family opened up Americo's. Americo's was really significant along with Perigari's. There was a group of restaurants that started moving into the central city. Most of them were not fine dining, but used fresh seasonal ingredients and the foods from their homelands. There was Peter Hall Fish Emporium, Peter Torza at Harlow's, Jerry Franco Badu. Jerry Franco Badu, I have 80 hours of him on tape. If I ever wrote that book, it would blow the restaurant industry out because he talks about sex, drugs, and rock and roll a lot in these places. But he was at A.G. Bumps, where they created the first salad bar in California, I might say. Deneb Williams, who went to the Firehouse Bill Shanley, to name just a few. But I want to call attention to the hundreds, if not thousands, of Chinese, Black, and Mexican, Filipino cooks who have always worked in the kitchens. We only hear about the people who are front of the house or that own them. But those, to me, are the people who are really uncredited. So again, before I throw it over, the Renaissance to me really began with the small eateries that started going in to what we now call Midtown, the central area. That included Pava's, which was at 23rd and K Street, Nicole's Omelets, and also Juliana's Kitchen, The Grapevine, Green Street Cafe, Americo's, Pearson's Natural Eatery, Weatherstone's Coffee and Tea. What was unique about these places was, unlike today, nobody went to a culinary academy. Most had no restaurant experience. Most had to mortgage if they had a house or borrow money from friends. Or friends actually built out, like at Americo's, the place. And they ended up leasing all of the Victorians and old places that were decaying downtown. If it hadn't been for these restaurateurs prior to 1976, we would not have saved all of the Victorians that had the central city as important as it is today. They moved into old Chinese laundries, grocery stores, you name it, and on little money started opening up a business. What was common about almost all of them is they had lots of ferns and plants. Oh, you have a question?
Yeah. Do you know where?
Oh, can we get a microphone on him possibly?
Do you know where Effie moved to?
Well, Eppie's, to me, we're not going to talk about Eppie's because Eppie's was at 28th and Capitol. When he ended up closing down, his father owned the Prado, and he was very instrumental. But the only place that was still open was in West Sacramento, and I believe that that's closed as well. And it's been gone for some time. And even though he had his offices, by the way, at 1731 L Street. I don't know why I remember that.
A legacy of Eppie's persists in the Great Race. So
Named,
yes,
you know,
that
race that is still thriving.
His name lives on in events in Sacramento, but not in
Right.
actual restaurants.
Right.
But
And I was going to say most, and then I'll throw it back. Most lived in or near downtown. They oftentimes lived up above the restaurant that they were at. And the other thing that they started introducing was local wines from Amador County and from Lodi, which hadn't done before. And what was unique was they started showing the work of local artists, and you could actually buy a piece of art when you went in. And Pava's was the one that I might not go into much more detail, but David Lance Goines, who put Chez Panisse on the map as far as I'm concerned, did his first show in Sacramento there in 1979, which is where I met him, and then later I helped rep his work. Later. I'm going to throw it over to you.
well, I'm actually going to quibble with you about a term you've been using, and
Okay.
I think maybe we can discuss
Okay, good.
how to frame this.
Okay.
But you know, you've said a couple of times times the Renaissance started here at different dates. I would actually argue that there's not a single Sacramento restaurant renaissance, but that what we have really is like an ongoing evolution of new trends, new changes, especially in fine dining, which is the highest profile. But you see like changes and shifts in values kind of generationally and over time. You know, like as somebody who came in to Sacramento 20 years ago, at that time, you know, and I came from San Francisco, which had obviously a really robust and kind of nationally famous dining scene. And so and I was working in food writing. I was an editor at a food magazine, and as I was moving because my husband was working at Sac State and he was living here and I was living in San Francisco, and some of my colleagues were like, "What are you doing moving to Sacramento? You're a food writer." And I said, there will be food to write about, I guarantee, because there is food everywhere that there are people. But also, you know, I had been spending time here because my family was here and knew that there were new things, new changes, things opening up. And was it as high profile or as maybe glitzy or like experimental as the Bay Area? No, because we don't have the population or the like economic base to support that in fine dining. But we do have a lot of really good food and a lot of really creative, thoughtful, ambitious restaurateurs, many of whom from the prior generation you've mentioned. But I think a new generation comes in and wants to make change and wants to do something different and new. And Sacramento maybe has a little more conservative palate than some other towns, but like there have always been people pushing the envelope and making new kind of renaissances, but then old favorites stick around and coexist with those. You know, I think there was a big shift in the late aughts, you know, up to 2010, early teens, and that was the era of when, if I may jump forward.
Of course.
If I'm not
No, not at all. I did not want to do chronology.
Forward, you know, around that time, 2000, you know, 5 to 2015 was the big era of farm to fork, which, you know, became both a marketing term, but also a thing that restaurateurs were embracing and really pushing the local produce, pushing the envelope on what they were putting on the menus, what kind of things they could offer. And I think right now, possibly also in part due to the pandemic, we're a little bit due for, you know, what is the next thing. But there was this huge shift that I was seeing happen as I was writing about food. And you mentioned a lot of chefs who, you know, who came out of this kitchen and then opened this thing. There's always a genealogy or like a family tree of restaurants. So if I think about the restaurants that opened 15-ish years ago that are really influential, like look at the people who came out of the kitchen of Mulvaney's and have gone on to open different things, kind of having been formed by that experience. Look at there's a number of chefs who've come out of the kitchen of Ella or the kitchen who've gone on to open new things. Peregary's continued to be a really influential group in terms of producing chefs and producing, you know, cooks that went on to kind of like seed different places and to open in different neighborhoods. When I moved to Sacramento, the thing that I saw and thought was missing, like there was fine dining, and there has always been an amazing, incredibly diverse, delicious array of less expensive, everyday neighborhood restaurants that relate to our huge and wonderful and like real strength of like immigrant communities and the diversity of Sacramento. I adore going out and like going to those restaurants, tasting those different flavors, all of that. That's always been present in Sacramento. When I moved here, I kind of missed the mid-tier, the like Wednesday night, like not quite fine dining, but in the middle that was like in a neighborhood restaurant. But like in terms of like going out to get, you know, tacos or a bowl of pho or, you know, Korean food out on Folsom Boulevard or so many different things. There are so many opportunities for different kinds of dining, and there always have been.
So I'm going to agree with you.
Yeah.
The reason that I call it a renaissance in this instance is there was this like 30-year period where it was pretty stable and you didn't have a lot of choices. It was the 70s where, as far as I'm concerned, the farm to fork movement really started. And who exemplified it was David Suhu, who owned Xinhua East West. His family had owned a series of Chinese restaurants. He opened it with his brothers. He was the first one who said, why do Chinese restaurants have to use canned sauces and water chestnuts? I can use fresh. He has told the story of you knew whether how good a restaurant was by how many fresh bean sprouts they were ordering, literally per week. Randy Paragary's operation had their own community garden at, well, right behind, it was on 28th Street, where they grew all their own fresh fruits and vegetables. The farmers, even then, and we had a few farmers markets, would literally go to restaurants' back doors to deliver fresh fruits. These businesses didn't use what are some, Cisco, Rycroft, and some of the others, but they were really starting to look. So when 2012 occurred and we became the farm to fork capital, I was really PO'd because I thought this is our tradition, literally. And it was a tradition that started, you've probably heard me say, the first use of farm to table was David Lubin, who owned Weinstock's Lubin, who coined it in 1915 because he wanted to create CSAs where farmers could mail their product in what we now call consumer supported
CSA boxes. Yeah.
And you would send it so you could get fresh food to markets.
Yeah,
so
and he was interesting because he was, both my kids went to the school named for David Lubin, and and I actually live on the street where the house where he that he built. So, but and I wrote about him because the school sponsors the garden tour, and found out a little bit about his history. He was really instrumental in trying to combat world hunger and was like a forerunner of what is now like the anti-hunger organization within the UN.
Right.
That was like his kind of big international philanthropic endeavor, which is like interesting.
Yeah.
Just
and one of
as
the
a
best
sideline.
one of the best restaurants was actually in Weinstock's, the lunch counter at Weinstock's. So thank you for bringing that up. Kate, I do want to ask you because we're a restaurant reviewer critic, and there were some wonderful ones, before you. And everything that I do for research, 90% of what I get from newspaper articles because that's where it was written about the most, and recipes that were in the Sacramento Bee, the Sacramento Union, the Sacramento Observer, the Suttertown News, Mom Guess What. The importance of having community reviewers. So what role do you think that they play now that we don't, am I right? We no longer, the Sacramento Bee reviewed number of restaurants every week or eateries.
Well, yeah, I mean, by my time we were doing maybe 2 to 3 formal reviews a month. So
What's
not
happening now?
weekly. Well, my former colleague, Benji Eagle, who's there.
Oh, that's true.
He
Benji's
does
used
a
us.
lot of food
does do a
coverage.
lot
He
of food
covers
coverage.
what's new on the scene, covers trends. He actually just came out with, he and under the auspices of the Bee just came out with a cookbook collecting chef recipes from Sacramento. So there is still robust food coverage at the Bee. It's a little bit different in the way it's shaped. It's a little more news driven, though he also does like evaluative coverage and review kinds of things, and he works very hard covering the scene. So I would by no means want to say that like they've abandoned food coverage in any way, shape, or form.
Okay, good. And where I get a lot
he's
of
great.
I get a lot of my news from the Sacramento Business Journal, which lists almost every month they have, and Benji does it too, the 30 restaurants that opened up this month. What you're going to find is they didn't open up in Sacramento. They opened up in Roseville and El Dorado. And you kind of did, so I was going to ask you, I've done a little bit about where we were and where the changes are. Where are we right now? Current scene.
That's a great question. I feel like I have to say I'm not as hooked into the very current, like up to the moment scene of like going out to eat at all of the new, especially the fine dining restaurants, because it turns out that when you are a critic and somebody is paying your bill to go to the restaurants, you have to do it for work, you're a lot more motivated to go out to like expensive restaurants every week. It's a little harder to do when it's on your own dime. Though I do still dine out and try to hit both old favorites and new things. I think there are some stalwarts of the scene that are still thriving and turning out absolutely wonderful food. Waterboy springs to mind, kind of at the top of the list. I love what Rick does. I think it's always on point. And in terms of like neighborhood restaurants, like my family's favorite is One Speed in his more casual place in East Sacramento. I have kind of thought for a while that we are due for another evolution or renaissance, but there are places opening up, new things. The pandemic did put a crimp in restaurateurs. Like it was a tough time, but like we've seen like Mike Thiemann reopen Mother in a different location. That's a all vegetarian restaurant. He had also had Empress prior to the pandemic. Oh, sorry, I just touched my mic. I didn't mean to do that. And a lot of other things. And he, I like what he does. And previously, Mother was counter service, and now it's sit down table service. So it's evolved. We've always had we have a strong showing of pizza. There's some interesting new places, casual, like Pizza Supreme Being is just doing like interesting, innovative stuff. People are doing like things on social media, like and evolving stuff. Renaissances of places. Prior to us getting the program started formally, somebody asked about Jim Denny's, the old lunch counter. And Gina Guyton, who had South Restaurant, which was one of my favorites in the Southside Park area, which closed, has moved on to reopen Jim Denny's as like, again, as a lunch counter, but with innovative new stuff. She does interesting things with like hamburgers, hot dogs, like lunch counter food at a very accessible price point. And also has brought back like her fried chicken, which was amazing on like Fried Chicken Fridays, and has really like, I think, thought outside the box of like what kind of place to open and what to do with this historic site. And I just look at that and I think of that as like a really great sign for the kinds of innovation and moving the scene forward, but that's still tied to the history and the familiar and not abandoning what Sacramento always had to offer, and honestly, like that's a tough location where she is.
Absolutely.
And I know she's had break-ins.
We have a question in the audience.
Oh, absolutely.
I'd like you to define Renaissance as you use it in your conversation. I've taken it to mean a couple of different nuances on it. So I'd like to hear what your definition of Renaissance is.
Well, I think, the dictionary definition would just be rebirth.
Right.
Rebirth of the restaurant scene. And this was the point on which I, slightly pushed back on that idea, because I think that implies a scene that has died and is coming back to life. Whereas I would say that really what we have is a constantly evolving and changing scene with new opportunities, new flavors, new people driving the conversation. I don't know if you'd like to add.
So I agree. There's an evolution in food, and what I do like about today, what's happening today, is the I call it global kind of expansion, and also and it's not all immigrants. My apologies to Brickland, who's owned by Afghan owners, who said, we've been here for 30 years. We're not immigrants. Thank you. And our food does not reflect necessarily Afghan where we are, but we're really fusion. And to me, all food is fusion, because we're bringing our culture with us from where we ever are, and we're adapting to where we are. But what we do have now, this rebirth, is for the first time I'm seeing restaurants that are willing to stay less assimilated into American, or I'm sorry for saying it, white bread tastes, and saying, this is where I come from and I want the food to reflect me. And the expression that I want. And so I think there's a fearlessness, if that's the word you want to use. The other thing I love is that you have somebody like Billy Crew, which is going to lead into my next question, who's, if I'm right, Korean, right? Isn't he Korean? Or,
Vietnamese, I believe.
Vietnamese, I'm sorry.
Billy No.
Billy No,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Who has Crew, but he's doing, a Japanese restaurant. And if you look at who owns restaurants, Koreans own 90% of the Japanese restaurants today. There's only 2 Japanese or 3 Japanese restaurants actually owned by a Japanese person. That's just changed because Fuji's is reopening. And the Wong family that owns, Cafeteria 15L, Iron Horse, Mas Taco?
Yeah.
A Chinese family, but have opened a variety of different, restaurants because they don't want to be pigeonholed.
Yeah,
And
they were, around the time I moved here, they were really pushing the envelope on fine dining with Masons.
Absolutely,
And expanding, and they have
expanding.
roots actually in fast food is where I believe the family got their start, fast food and much
Right.
more casual.
So, and I'm
long
just
time
really
ago.
aware of time. So I'm going to ask, we talked about Billy No, who's up for a James Beard Award winner. We're not going to talk about the new Michelin system, which I hate. We paid to get into the book. And I'm going to say my favorite restaurants, and then I want you to do yours or who you would give credit to. If you don't do anything else, please go to the Slough House Kitchen up in Slough House. It was owned by friends of ours, Terry Gilliland, who is a LADAM member, and others. They're a couple from Moldova by way of Italy, and the most innovative, exciting, wonderful comfort food you're going to have in a long time. To me, if I was going to award a Michelin star, that's probably the restaurant I would give it to. And I'm going to ask you, if you could award some honors on some place, what would it be?
I honestly think Crew is doing amazing work. Their sushi is fantastic, but also their other menu, like small plates and other parts of it, like innovative, interesting, super on point, like probably the toughest reservation in town. I actually had the good fortune to go there just a couple of weeks ago.
I hope he wins because
he
really deserves it.
It was wonderful, and I also think about that because he started out in a tiny venue on J Street in Midtown, like around the time I moved to Sacramento. Crew was a very small operation, and now it's in this big, beautiful space. There's the sushi bar, it's beautifully decorated. It's like the ambition of what he's done and like pushed the envelope, I think, on his own cooking and on what he's offering, because he has allied other restaurants and has had some ventures that haven't panned out long term, but he's always kind of pushing and seeing like what's next, and I have enjoyed everything he's done. Other places I really love to eat, I love the Hawks on Alhambra. They have their fine dining restaurant up in Granite Bay, and I haven't been there for a long time. But the Hawks Public House in is I think is always wonderful. Great cocktails, just really good food. They do like house-made charcuterie and things that are fantastic. I often blank on this question, this kind of question, which is terrible.
I hate it.
But yeah, where else? You know where deserves a shout out, and this is not in Sacramento proper, but is Nick's Taco up in Roseville, Patricia Wise's taco. Nick's Taco. N-I-X and then taco. And
Jacqueline's, I believe is what it's called in Auburn.
And I haven't made it there yet, and I've heard it's amazing.
So don't be afraid to venture a little out of Sacramento.
Yeah,
we're including it when we.
Is it Jacqueline or Josephine?
I'm sorry, Josephine. I was thinking of Jacqueline in San Francisco.
But yeah, and I heard Nick's Taco is going to open up another thing somewhere. Anyway, lots
good.
to love and enjoy.
All right, and So I noticed that we're getting close to 11:30, so I'm going to, before we wrap it up, ask if there are any more comments or questions from the audience, or if we've...
Question online.
Yes.
Just any statistics about food trucks in the
Thank
Sacramento
you.
area?
Yes. So food trucks, kind of been there, done that. That's kind of my view. I mean, we still have them in a lot, but there was a big movement some years back, and there are actually fewer of them now than there were just even 5 years ago, again, because of the pandemic. I would say more than anything else. What's interesting is what I'm going to call street food and mobile food. Sacramento doesn't have the same tradition that other cities have had, for that. There are some great places. Many of the people who start food trucks then go to brick and mortar restaurants. So they use them as, I hate to call it incubators, I think, for what their ideas were. And one of the first food trucks that was successful was Vallejo's, whose mother started off way back in so I came back to Sacramento in 76. She had a little tamale burrito cart that would come by the offices downtown. Crepe Danielle you could go off to Crepe Danielle and he'd make crepes on the street. So a lot of, even there before the trucks. Did you want to make a comment about trucks?
No, I mean, I do think like the ones that have lasted and that are really like high quality now,
Right.
there was a real flowering of them and a lot of different kinds of cuisines and things like that. And there were festivals. Now I think there are, as you say, fewer, but there are some really great and solid ones, and taco trucks in particular that have kind of like made a showing or made a like stake to claim in particular, like a particular spot and with particular specialties that are really worth seeking out.
And I don't know if they're still really active, but the Wynn Park, which is at 28th and P Street, has one of the best array of trucks where you would get food you've never had elsewhere. West African, Caribbean, Argentinian. So again, the variety of things that you can get for that kind of takeout is really high. Another question. Thank you, Sheila.
I've lived in Sacramento for a long time, and I didn't know most of what you've said today, so thank you for the wonderful presentation.
well, thank
My
you.
question is about the 79 fine dining restaurants in Sacramento. Who picked them, and is there some place where we could see a list of them? Thank you.
Yes, in fact, thank you. If you want to get this information, I do have a list of what's considered the 79 and can direct you to other sites. It's morningcoffeepress@gmail.com. Morning Coffee, which is the name of this program, press@gmail.com. And I'm also going to send to Scott Akamoto or Sean to see if we can't get it on our website at accsv.org, if there's going to be a place where we could not only have updates for the cookbook, which we'll plug, but that's where you can get them. Yeah, another question before we wrap up. Yep.
Here. The mid-level dining places that you would like to eat currently in Sacramento?
So I'll tell you, the mid-level to me is pick almost any Thai restaurant, any Vietnamese restaurant, any Korean, Indian, Nepali, almost any of those to me where you can still sit down. I still like to go to a restaurant and be convivial. I like to sit around a table and have a conversation. I like to know the owner or the chef or the waiter, if I can, wait staff, I guess I would call it. I like building relationship. So I tend to go to some of the same restaurants over and over. What I would do is what I'm going to call eat a street. If you just go down 16th Street now, you will have Magpie, Maydoun. I mean, there's just a plethora of restaurants. If you go down Freeport Boulevard, the amount of, and I'm sorry for grouping Asian together, Chinese, Japanese, Filipino, boba places that are there. Obviously, we call little, Saigon. Just pick a street. 21st Street is another street that's kind of active. And just say, I'm going to start with Journey to the Dumpling because I can't afford Localis, which will cost you $2.25 a meal. But you could, for me, because I'm within walking distance of 21st, I could eat in a different restaurant a week.
Yeah.
For a year, just walking one street. And most of those to me, and I would avoid fast food. I'm sorry, I just don't believe in McDonald's, Taco Bell. And one last thing, and I'm going to let you do the same thing. If you vow anything after the pandemic, I try to avoid any chain restaurant. I try to support the local businesses that I want to see survive into the future. And that means the independent restaurants, cafes, butcher shops, bakeries. We didn't even talk about the coffee houses. Where we get our food, where we eat, is much different from what we used to. So I'm going to let you answer that one.
Well, the coffee houses, bakeries, dessert places, if we think about somebody like Ginger Elizabeth or
right.
Real Pie Company, or like there's a lot of great things happening in like pastry and sweets and baking.
Right.
A new place that I absolutely love, though the line is always super long because they're only open a few days a week, is Moonbelly at 65th and Folsom. Their baking is amazing. We're having a renaissance of renaissance. There's that word again. We're having
But that's
bread.
a real rebirth because
Yeah.
we had lousy bread and
Yeah,
pretty mediocre bakeries.
Faria is also a great bakery in Oak Park, and they have other locations. In terms of streets that you mentioned, streets to eat your way along, I would also give a shout out to Fulton Boulevard. And we have not really talked about the, you mentioned Afghan, but we haven't talked about much of the Middle Eastern food that has really grown here. And I think that's as a consequence of like new community coming in.
Right.
And that the Mediterranean and Middle Eastern food is phenomenal, and there's some great baked breads and baked goods with that as well. You mentioned Thai. My recent favorite Thai place is Kin Thai in Midtown, which has like kind of a street food feeling, but it's a sit-down restaurant in the Mars complex, like on 20th between J and K. I just love their flavors, and they're a little different from a lot of the other Thai restaurants in town. So that's a place that I have really been enjoying. Gosh, there's so many mid-range and good things. I feel like I'm leaving out literally hundreds, as we have discussed.
So we're going to wrap it up, but we get to do our plugs first. And that is, the first one is, if you have not yet purchased your copy of The Foods We Share, The Stories We Tell, this is the ACC Community Cookbook. I'm going to be giving a gift to Kate as a thank you for being our guest today. It is available at accsv.org/cookbook. I think I'm right on that one. And Lost Restaurant of Sacramento and the Recipes is just one of my books. I've got a special, again, if you go to Morning Coffee Press, the book costs $20, but $7.50 if you purchase it will go back to either ACC, or if you're a Renaissance member and would like it to go to the ASI Food Pantry, that's where the proceeds beyond the cost of the book. The Foods We Share, The Stories We Tell, we're going to be doing a demo and book signing, I guess you would call it, sometime in March at Wild Women Bookstore in East Sacramento. And do you want to say how you can get your book?
Sure. My book is available anywhere online, bookshop.org. It is on Amazon. It is out in paperback. I happen to be out of paperback copies personally, but I do also know, I really encourage, we do have a wonderful independent bookstore community here in Sacramento, and I happen to work part-time at one also in East Sacramento, East Village Bookshop, and I know we have a copy in stock, and we'll have more, so if you
I'm hoping
can
that we're
purchase
gonna-
locally.
Yeah. I'm hoping
but
we're going to be able to do a cookbook talk there,
yeah,
by the way, as well.
I can put you in touch with Sabrina.
Oh, good. And back to Lost Restaurants, it's also available on Amazon, but I try to avoid Amazon at all costs.
But I do understand that people buy books there. So,
Okay, so
yes.
next month our conversation is going to be hidden figures. Marge Tarble, who's part of Alter Egos, is going to be, she doesn't know it yet, but she's going to be doing one of the women. And we're going to be talking about the women that you never hear about because it's Women's History Month that have made the same kind of impact on Sacramento. So tune in for that. It'll again be from 10:30 to 11:30. And in April, we're going to be doing the story kind of the blue zones. Sacramento's just been designated, and how to take the recipes from ACC's book and make them more plant-based as well. So there's lots of morning coffee programs. If you have ideas of what we should talk about, please let us know. And I'm going to let you have the last word.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you so much to everyone for coming. It's a great turnout. Thank you to everyone who joined us online as well, and thank you, Mary Ellen, for having me. Happy eating.
I said she was going to get the last word. She didn't. Thank you, Sean Hidalgo.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful.